Apologies, everyone. I had to borrow someone else's device. I had some horrible technical difficulties. My extreme apologies. So I am just getting up my notes, and we'll just go ahead and start our working session. All right. Morning, everyone. I'm Councilor Lydia Edwards, Chair of the Committee on Government Operations. It's Thursday, April 22nd, and we're here today for a virtual working session on Docket 0397, Ordinance on Surveillance, Oversight, and Information Sharing. This matter was sponsored by Councilor Arroyo and Councilor Wu, and was referred to the committee on March 3rd, 2021. This matter is a refile from last year, and the committee held a hearing and working session on this matter last year. In accordance with Governor Baker's executive order modifying open meeting laws, we are having this working session via Zoom, and in order for us to balance the public safety needs of today, but also the ability to do our jobs. The public may watch this working session via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-tv and on Xfinity 8, RCN 82, Verizon 964. It will be rebroadcasted at a later date. Written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.go@boston.gov and will be made a part of the record and available to all councilors. Quick summary: this legislation establishes standards for surveillance, oversight, and information sharing. The docket requires community involvement when surveillance is used and when the city acquires surveillance technology. The legislation limits information sharing between Boston Public Schools and the Boston Police Department. The legislation requires the mayor establish a surveillance use policy that applies to every city department and that the city council approve the policy. Participating today on the behalf of the administration is David Elgids. I messed that up, didn't I?
No, that works.
It's okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Information and DeWitt. Gregory McCarthy, Chief of Information, also at Information Security Officer at DeWitt. Christopher Carter, Co-Chair of the New Urban Mechanics. Nayeli Rodriguez, Technologist for the Public Realm, a New Urban Mechanics. Samuel DePina, Director of Operations of BPS, and Superintendent Paul Donovan, Chief of the Bureau of Investigative Services of BPD, Boston Police Department. Also joining us today are Valeria Dovali, student from the Student Immigrant Movement, Cade Crockford, Director of the Technology for Liberty program of the ACLU, Liz McIntyre, staff attorney and the Director of the School to Prison Pipeline and Intervention Project at Greater Boston Legal Services, Elizabeth Badger, a staff attorney at PAIR Project, and Nora Paul Schultz of Unafraid Educators. I'm going to shortly turn it over to the lead sponsors, but I just wanted to acknowledge who is here today. We have Councillor Ed Flynn, Councillor Sabi George, Councillor Michelle Wu, Councillor, of course, Ricardo Arroyo, Councillor Mejia, and Councillor Liz Braden, Councillor Bach, and myself, the chair. So with that, I'm going to quickly turn it over to the lead sponsors for some brief opening remarks, and then I will call out the rest of the councillors for brief opening remarks. I don't know if you have, between the co-sponsors, I'm sure you can work it out.
Go for it, Councillor Arroyo.
Thank you, Councillor Wu. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to thank our partners in getting this to the table and getting this put together. So a sincere thank you to the Students Immigrants Movement, the ACLU Mass, Greater Boston Legal Services, the PAIR Project, and Unafraid Educators, as well as my co-sponsors on this, Councilor Michelle Wu, who also led on the facial recognition ban, and our current mayor now, but was the co-sponsor on this, Mayor Janey, for being part of the early working sessions and the drafting of this ordinance. I think you did a great job summing it up, but largely what this ordinance seeks to do is provide protections both to our constituents and residents, but also most especially to our children in BPS schools, and really trying to cut down ways in which information is shared to ICE, furthering the school to deportation pipeline, and BPD in furtherance of the school to prison pipeline. This ordinance seeks to really streamline and make sure that protections are in place that go a little bit further than the protections that we currently have to ensure that those students are both safe in school and safe from those who have power to share information and to surveil them in ways that could harm them, both in that moment, in the future, in ways in which we can't make right, for instance, a deportation. And so this is something I look forward to passing with the rest of the council. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Wu?
Good morning, everyone. Happy school vacation week to those who are also juggling these days. I just wanted to say thank you and echo the lead sponsor here, and thank Madam Chair for continuing to move this along. Thank you especially to this coalition. I know this legislation is timely, it is urgent. The news reminds us every day why steps like this are important. But I also want to point out how long of a journey this has been, and that this coalition has been working on legislation and this push for years at this point. Our first council hearing, many last term under different leadership. And, so the groundwork has been laid for a long time. Boston has now fallen behind other cities across the country and across the state that have taken these steps. And so the language before you today really reflects the best practices from a lot of research. Again, thanks to this coalition. And I feel really good about the product we're at today in terms of the legislative language, and looking forward to getting into it and hashing out final details. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And in order of arrival, after this, we have Councillor Flynn, Councillor Braden, Councillor Mejia, Councillor Sabi George, and then Councillor Bach. So Councillor Flynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Edwards, for your leadership. Thank you to my colleagues, to the community activists that are here as well. I also want to acknowledge and say thank you to Superintendent Paul Donovan from the Boston Police as well for his professionalism for so many years on the Boston Police Department. I have no opening statement. Thank you, Councillor Edwards.
Thank you. Councillor Braden.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. I am not quite on the same page this morning. I'm glad to be here. I hope to listen and learn and participate in the conversation as we go forward. Thank you, everyone who's here. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mejia?
Yeah. Thank you to the chair and to the sponsors for calling this working session. I was in support of this ordinance last year, and I look forward to using this working session to find ways to make it even stronger. The issue is personal and professional for me. We started our team in our office by filing a hearing on sanctuary safe spaces, and we are currently working with advocates, some who are on this panel today, to make improvements to the ways the city protects undocumented immigrants. I see this ordinance as working in hand with that. Too many students in our schools are at risk of losing their rights because of improper information sharing and surveillance. So I'm looking forward to diving in, and really do appreciate the sponsors for bringing it forth.
Thank you. I believe Councillor Sabi George is next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As this is a working session, happy to get to the work. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Councillor Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, I'm in transit to City Hall right now. I just want to express my, support for the aims, the sort of dual aims of this ordinance. I think probably the biggest working session concern I have is just making sure, I think in dealing with the BPD, BPS thing, we're sort of dealing with one set of issues, and then there's the set of issues around how all of our other departments handle data. And I just want to make sure that we have language that's well enough tailored to that second set of issues as well, just so that we've got a ordinance that we can pass that will be workable and effective for all our departments. But very much a supporter of the idea that there needs to be democratic oversight over all surveillance by government. So grateful to the makers and happy to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you very much. At this point, I'm happy to turn it over to the administration and to hear your thoughts, if your thoughts have changed since the last time we spoke, if there are any concerns, if you've reviewed the language. And I'll just go in the order of the folks that I just introduced before. So we'll start with David from Do It.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and to all my colleagues, the members of the City Council joining us here this morning as well. Thank you for the opportunity now, and I will be brief as we have a lot of ground to cover today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dave Eldris. I'm Mayor Janey's Chief Information Officer. I don't want to take up a lot of time this morning. As I said, we have a lot of ground to cover, but I thought it would be helpful to, before getting started, to do a little table setting, giving kind of the brief overview around Do It and its roles and responsibilities as it relates to this proposed ordinance. A quick overview of Do It's current role managing surveillance technology as identified in the draft ordinance. Although the Department of Innovation and Technology, Do It, may provide the technology outlined in the ordinance, we do not historically define governance, policy, or around usage of who gets access to the specific systems as decided typically by each department. Do It also does not currently position as a centralized IT department across all city departments. So if an ordinance were to pass as is, it'd be very difficult to implement and operationalize citywide, as it would invoke working across separate IT departments, such as BPS's IT department, BPD's IT department. A suggestion for the current iteration of this proposed ordinance would be to consider Boston Public Schools and Boston Police Department and City Department separately to get to what we believe is the intent of the ordinance. We suggest narrowing some of the definitions around surveillance data, and surveillance technology. Happy to dive into that, as we go into this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think after David, we had, Gregory McCarthy.
Gregory is not going to be in today's meeting. I'm covering for him too.
Are you covering? Okay, then. So I'm going to go then to Christopher Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Chris is fine, unless you're my 80-year-old aunt who likes to call me by my full name. Agreeing with Chief Eldis and I think what Councillor Bach was saying too, the sort of dual pieces in this ordinance and the language, I think require a little bit more review. I think the sort of combination of BPS and BPD, and then the impact on city departments and how they use technologies and use data should be certainly looked at, but I think they require maybe separate conversations. So that's something I think we brought up in the last working session, but certainly something I think after reviewing it again, we still think might sort of bear out to be something that's worthwhile doing. I think something we proposed the last time was also some immediate action steps that could be taken around adopting the public data trust principles that Do It and Newer Mechanics have worked on that are sort of posted publicly now. And then I think we have some interest in understanding a way to sort of examine what the proposed ordinance impact would be on city operations, training opportunities, procurement procedures, costs associated with it, and staffing needs for implementation, as well as sort of the auditing. And that comes out of a conversation that we had with our colleagues in Seattle, as well as a few other cities who have implemented ordinances and sort of going through that process over multiple years, unearthing some of those challenges, and we'd like to sort of understand what those impacts are up front. So looking forward to the conversation today, and I'll pass it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Is Nayeli also, is Nayeli available?
Yep, I'm here. I think Chris pretty much covered it. I'll just underscore that we're very interested in helping to accomplish the intent of this ordinance, but I think intent and impact are not necessarily the same thing when it comes to the different departments that are mentioned and considered together right now. And we definitely can't legislate trust within the public. And part of that is passing something that not only protects privacy, but also protects transparency and awareness. And so a lot of our recommended edits not only, I think, improve our ability to preserve operational functions that might have been unintentionally impacted by including them along with BPD and BPS, but also focus on developing just awareness, transparency, and knowledge, both for the city employees and also for the general public, to kind of foster just a bigger culture of awareness and engagement on a lot of these public trust issues.
Okay, thank you. And then I think Samuel DePina.
morning, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. And good morning, other members of the City Council. Again, we want to also thank many of the participants and partners who have kind of helped us along with not only this ordinance, but also help inform our Boston Public School policy that Dr. Gaselius was really adamant about putting in place because she's very concerned about this issue and wants to make sure that we're a partner at the table to have discussions now and going forward and to continue monitoring our work as it relates to these efforts. So we're here to give some of our feedback and some suggestions. Since we met last, there has been also some state legislation changes that also impact this work and our work specifically with the Boston Public Schools that we'll talk more about as we get into the working session. So happy and excited to be here today and look forward to our progress. Thank you.
Thank you. And then finally, we have Superintendent Paul Donovan from BPD.
Excuse me. Good morning, Councilor, to everyone else on the call this morning. Thank you. So the police department, we're in agreement with, the broad intent of the ordinance. We just think that it's too broad, I guess, in its scope. It's not clearly defined how it's going to, impact our operations. We're in support of, protecting the civil liberties of everyone in the city, especially students in our school system. But we're also concerned on how this is going to impact our ability to deploy our resources and then to conduct follow-up investigations into criminal activity in the city. And, there's things I think that we can definitely agree to and work with, but there's some things I'd like to discuss as far as how, it impacts our ability to do to police the city, day in and day out and just provide services to the citizens. So thank you.
Thank you. So to the lead sponsors, I just looking to you for a little guidance. I'm inclined to go to the language and get to work and have advocates kind of discuss parts of it so we could make this as much as we can in this time. Or if you would like, if each one of the advocates, if you wanted to do a brief statement, I don't know. For me, I'm inclined to get to the language. I'm looking at as many of, I'm looking at Michelle and I'm trying to see Councilor Arroyo.
That works for me.
I'm seeing mostly nods from the advocates too, but if anyone wanted to chime in, I would say the advocates have certainly done the most work out of anyone in this room. So by all means, if anyone wants to speak now, they definitely should.
Chair Edwards, I would just say, good morning, everyone. Kate Crawford from the ACLU. I agree. I think we should get to the language. Curious to know what specifically the administration takes issue with. So thanks.
Okay. So let's go to the language. We got a lot of work to do. So does everyone have a copy of the filed ordinance in front of them? All right, let's do this. So we're going straight first. I'm going to go ahead and skip the purpose in terms of the back and forth, unless anyone has anything on that particular concern with the goal and purpose of this. That's pretty flexible, language.
Councilor Superintendent Donovan, I just saw purpose is listed in 16-63.1. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes. All
right. So I'm in agreement with what's written there, but I would also like to see addressed, the police department would like to see addressed, which it's mentioned in the second to last whereas, where, I'd like to see added to allow for the appropriate use to assist in the charge of improving delivery of services and public safety. I think it's important that we recognize that, we keep that in mind, that we're able to improve delivery of services and public safety. Just the rest of the language is fine with us just adding that.
Okay, at the end then. So as one of the goal of this is to do that. Okay. I'm gonna be, it's just more efficient for me. Just raise your hand. Okay, if you guys want to respond, just raise your hand if you want to go to that. But I think because I have to keep switching through on this thing to see all of your faces, it's not going to be efficient. So I'm not going to call through for this. And to my colleagues and everybody, I'm going through this. It's 19 pages long, so we got to go through this. So raise your hand if you have opposition concern to what someone just suggested. Other than that, to Superintendent. Anybody else, if you have language specifically, please be sure to email it to the committee afterwards. I'm taking as good as notes as I can, but if you really do have some suggested language, please email it to me. Okay. Section definitions. All right. So now we're on to the definitions, and this is where I know some people wanted some narrower definitions and whatnot. We're dealing with the first annual surveillance report. It means a written report submitted by the mayor's office on an annual basis concerning specific surveillance technology used by the city department during the previous year and containing the information set forth in the ordinance. Seeing no hands, we're going on to exigent.
I just have a quick thing to mention there.
Please raise your hand. Please raise your hand.
Sorry.
Just because I may not hear you, and I'm going to keep moving, but please go ahead, Nayeli.
Oh, sorry about that. I was trying to figure out how to do it. And anyway, I think for the citywide report, there's sort of an implicit need there for a citywide audit of existing technologies in order to deliver that report. That is not a small undertaking. When we talked to Seattle, they estimated 4,400 person hours in order to complete that initial audit. So I think in order to deliver that, we need to make space for resources, both staff time and funding, in order to complete the audit that would be the basis for an annual report and to maintain that audit annually.
Kate?
Apologies for not raising my hand.
That's a lot of surveillance. I mean, I just want to say I totally understand that this is a bureaucratic burden for the administration. And I think it's an important one that the city takes on. If resources are being allocated to acquire and deploy and maintain and oversee the use of so many surveillance technologies, that a mere audit of all of the systems that are in use across the city would require 4,000 hours of staff time. I think that actually is an indication of how important the audit is, because it suggests to me that there's a lot of surveillance that's happening that maybe even folks in City Hall are not aware of. So I would just say that, not only for the public's edification and the city council's edification, but also for the administration's own edification of what is happening within and across city agencies, that strikes me as a reason to do it, actually.
Thank you. Councillor Flynn, you've raised your hand.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Councilor Edwards, just wanted to ask if the report was coming from the mayor's office. Just want to be accurate. Would it be coming from the legal counsel office from the mayor? Would it be coming directly from the mayor's central office? Is it forwarded from the Boston Police to the mayor's office? I just wanted to be certain on who would be eventually the sign-off person, and also if we are having the audit, I think it's important that this is the budget time that we need to make sure that there are funds in the budget going forward.
Thank you. In terms of the budget, you are correct. This would be the time to, if we are committed to this, to need an audit to add the funding. In terms of to the sponsors, how are you defining mayor's office? I take it to mean that it's the administration, Councillor Flynn. So anybody who works for the mayor who would be responsible for doing this. I see Superintendent Paul Donovan, you've raised your hand.
Yes, Councillor. So from the police department's perspective, we're just concerned too about, how much, the man hours it's going to take to comply with this. And because we're not sure exactly what is going to qualify as surveillance technology, surveillance data, because of, how we feel that the order is written. It's very broad, and it could encompass, just about everything we do. Our Mark 43 system, if that's, everything that goes in there is considered surveillance data, then, we're talking about a lot of data. The number of reports we take in every day, we utilize those reports in our investigation. Every piece of information that we take in the police department, from our FIO reports to the Mark 43, our 1-1 reports, our booking system, the arrest booking reports, every single piece of information is open to, it's intelligence for us. It's data that can be used to both in our deployment of resources, in our investigation of criminal activity. So we're looking at putting us, creating a significant amount of work, if that's the scope of what this ordinance is we're gonna have to comply with. I think we're gonna need more resources and more money to comply with that, I would think.
Thank you.
It's possible, you can do it. It's just how we're gonna accomplish that,
I first, two additional hands have come up. I'm going to go to Valeria because she hasn't spoken yet, and then to Kate. Valeria?
Yeah, maybe, I don't know if Kate what Kate was going to say, but I think, yes, it's going to be a lot of work, right? And we totally understand that, and we appreciate the work that would take place if this were to pass. But I think we're missing the point here that it's just, we don't currently have in our knowledge what are the current technologies being used, so we couldn't incorporate that into the ordinance. We can't incorporate things that we don't know if they exist. And so that's precisely what this ordinance is asking for. What does exist, right? And yes, you guys are going to continue to be able to use all of those systems. We're just going to need to know that they exist first. And I just wanted to say that.
Good point. Thank you. Go ahead. You're muted.
Thanks, Chair Edwards. So I just wanted to say, I understand the police department has concerns about how much time it's going to take them at the outset, just like other city departments do. I just want to stress, and you probably heard this, Chris, when you talked to folks in Seattle, that the bulk of the work here is really at the outset to document existing technologies, right? To perform that audit so that the public and the council, and as I said before, the administration can understand the systems that are currently being used. The administrative burden is much reduced after that initial outlet, at the outset, the work at the outset that has to be done to sort of ensure that nothing is grandfathered in without the approval of the public and the council. And so I just want to be clear about that it's really a one-time investment of significant staff time in each department. And this is not something that other communities in Massachusetts have required more resources to accomplish. So I just want to be clear about that as well. When we worked on this in Cambridge and Somerville, neither one of the police departments there got another dollar to comply with the ordinance. And we would oppose the allocation of more resources to the police department for fulfilling, the mandate of the ordinance. The police department's got a $4 million budget. So, my assumption is that you can find some of that money to apply to, staff who can take on what should not be, I don't think, an impossible task. My assumption is that the department has a list of the surveillance technologies that it owns. Maybe that's an inventory or something. It likely also has, a pretty clear understanding of the kinds of information systems that the department uses. And just to be clear, the ordinance does not require that every single time a police officer enters data into a database, that has to be approved by the city council. It's the Mark 45 system itself that has to be, information about which has to be disclosed and approved, not each time, the department wants to use that data system.
And just to be clear again, I wanted to just reiterate what Valeria has said. None of this also stops the surveillance. This is literally just knowing what tools are being used. Correct? Okay. Councillor Flynn raised his hand, and then after this, we're going to move on to exigent circumstances.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Edwards. I thank you again for your leadership. I'm still trying to ask what the intention is of Councillor Wu and Councillor Arroyo on who from the mayor's office would sign off. I don't mean to be a stickler about that, but it is important that someone, the buck stops with someone. Is it officially goes out by the mayor with the mayor's signature, or is it the legal department? There has to be accountability, and I'd rather know that answer now than try to figure this thing out next year when the report's due. I hope that's a reasonable.
Councillor Flynn.
Yeah, and then the other one, and then the other.
Or who in the mayor's office should submit this?
I think it should be directly under the mayor's name,
okay.
Regardless of who the mayor is. But the buck stops with the mayor. So I hope we can all agree that makes sense. And then the other aspect I just wanted to highlight is, does DoIT have a recommendation on, are you able to do what is being asked for you without an increase in funding? This is the time to, get involved. I would rather know now if you're able to do it with the funding or without the funding. And if you can't do it without the funding, let's advocate for the funding. This is the budget season, so I don't mean to be a stickler, but if we're going to be serious about this, let's advocate for funding and let us know if you can do it or you can't do it.
Appreciate those comments, and to do it, and to the resources are definitely necessary. I think we will probably need a number of what that resources, literally a budgetary item of what those resources and that money will need for this to actually happen. I do appreciate all the conversation, but the reason why I'm going section by section is so we can stay in those sections. So I have Councillor Mejia's raised her hand, and Emiliano Falcon Morano has raised his hand. Are we discussing the specific definition that we're on right now, or is it a general comment? Because if it's general, I'd like to wait till the end for that. But go ahead, Councillor Mejia.
Yeah, so I just wanted to get some clarity from Councillor Flynn, just in terms of where the buck stops. I do think that is it possible for us to just, because there is so much, there's always tension between groups and the administration. I just need a little bit more clarity in terms of the buck stopping with the mayor's office. And I'm sorry, I may have missed where that means. I just feel like, are there ways for us to put some parameters that there is a voice for community, that there is some sort of engagement with other stakeholders, so that it's not just concentrated power in one place?
Yeah, that's a good question, Councilor Mejia.
Just to make very clear about what that question is, the goal, as I understood, is just about the annual surveillance report. The other aspects of where communities are absolutely built into this ordinance is, of course, when it's coming before the city council for any approval of additional surveillance, of course, when it comes to budgeting, of course, in defining the aspects of BPS and BPD. So community is built into this. Community also built this ordinance. So I just wanted that to be very clear.
Yes,
on the annual surveillance, though, it should be just one person who holds that accountability.
Right. Yeah, so that's where my question is about. My question specifically is about the buck stopping in the mayor's office, and I'm just curious where the checks and balances about that power of, the balance of power in that space, and that's what I'm trying to get a better sense of. Mm-hmm. is who I just feel like one concentrated voice and one person overseeing all of that. I just for me, that's my question, is specifically about the checks and balances of where their power lies. And if the buck stops, as according to Councilor Finn's in the mayor's office, I just wanted to just explore what that means and how that feels and lands for folks.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Sorry, Councilor Flynn. How that the buck stopping at the mayor and is vital, because the way the community can hold the mayor accountable or hold the city accountable is because they would out in the enforcement section sue all the rights that are outlined in that in order to enforce this. And so if they violate this by not having the annual report, then there's a whole entire enforcement section in this ordinance that we'll also get to allows for the community to weigh in heavily. I hope that clarifies a little bit more about buck stopping, but how we counter and how we hold accountable.
Yeah, no, it kind of does. I'm just trying to get ahead of the situation where it's more of an intervention and more of a prevention, if you will, just to explore whether or not the buck stop just at the mayor's office feels right. But I see it three hands raised, so I would love to either just keep it moving and not hold on to this, or see what other folks have to say to what I'm trying to articulate here.
If folks are okay, I'm going to just go on from this, unless you have no, unless we're going on.
Councilor Edwards, could I just quickly respond? I probably should not have used the buck stops there. I meant the accountability. I should have rephrased it. The accountability, in my opinion, stops at the mayor's office when that report is sent. The annual report is sent. I basically wanted to know, is the report coming directly under the signature of the mayor, or is the report coming under the legal counsel for the city? That's what I meant in terms of the buck stops with the mayor. I should have said the accountability stops with the mayor, and I wanted to know who would basically sign the annual report. Would it be directly under the mayor's signature or the corporation counsel for the city of Boston, basically? Thank you, Councilor Edwards.
Thank you. Moving on.
Madam Chair, can I just, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Just to clarify, because I think we're talking about the specific language, and just to tie it back to why I think we don't need to change the language that is there in that provision, even though, to just address Councilor Flynn's concerns that there are multiple other ordinances that we have passed as a council where it assigns a report that is needed to, be issued at certain points of time. We don't specify the department in any of those reports. It usually comes, I'm pulling up the student housing report, for example. It has both the stamp of the logo of neighborhood development and the mayor's office right on there. And so I would not have us sort of pin it down of which department, because this is very broad. It spans every single department. If we had to pick a place, probably it would originate from Do It, because they have a purview over everything. But I don't believe that we need to tie down the language here, because it would then be different from every other ordinance that calls for a report as well.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. Thank you, Councilor Wu.
Okay, moving on. I'm sorry, Emiliana, you had your hand raised.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Hi, all. My name is Sabrina Falcomorano. I work at the ACLU of Massachusetts. And I just wanted to say a thing that I noted, that after working in Somerville and Cambridge with this type of ordinances, I think it's helpful to see the definitions in their context. For example, in this case, we're all discussing something about the annual surveillance report, and the section that deals with that which is section 1663.5, exactly outlines how this annual surveillance report has to be made. So it says that each city department has to send this report to the mayor, and then the mayor itself has to send the report to the city council. So it's already on the ordinance. So I would suggest, Chairman, that when we discuss the defined terms, they should be seen in context where they are used in the ordinance, because obviously the term itself will not contain everything that pertains to the issue to which that term relates. So I just wanted to know that. So thank you very much.
No, thank you so much. I wish I called on you earlier. So let's go to exigent circumstances, and then I will we'll go to the section, and then I'll try and find the section in the ordinance that deals directly with that. Okay. So exigent circumstances, of course, this means the police, or as defined, it means the police commissioner or the police commissioner's designee's good faith, reasonable belief that an emergency involving danger or death, physical injury, or significant property damage or loss, similar to those that would render it impractical to obtain a warrant, requires the use of the surveillance technology or the surveillance data it provides. The use of surveillance technology in exigent circumstances shall not infringe upon an individual's right to peacefully protest or exercise other lawful and protected constitutional rights. So I'm going to go through. If someone wants to raise their hand and give me the section before I have to go through and read all this again, that would be also helpful. And if anyone has anything on the specific language right now. Paul.
Yes, I just have a question regarding, so similar to those that would render it impracticable to obtain a warrant. So we're guided by case law as far as exigent circumstances. So I'm just, that's similar, again, that's a little vague, it's a little open-ended. What exactly is this ordinance talking about as far as exigent circumstances?
Okay. I just got a great suggestion from my good friend and colleague, Councillor Bach. The way I'm approaching this ordinance might be causing more confusion. So instead of going by definitions and then trying to find the section, why don't we just go straight to the overall sections? And then if we need clarification, we'll go back up to the definitions. I don't think that this is, I'm not approaching this the best way. Is that okay with the lead sponsors?
That sounds great.
That's fine with me.
I think it worked on another ordinance. It's not working on this one. So let's actually then go to the overall, past the definitions, we're going to go straight to community control over surveillance. That's section 16-63.3. All right. Okay, exceptions and exemptions. The following situations are exceptions and exemptions from this ordinance. The following do not constitute surveillance data, and the requirements of this ordinance do not apply to them. Surveillance data acquired where the individual knowingly and voluntarily consented to provide the information, such as submitting personal information for the receipt of city services, and surveillance data acquired where the individual was presented with a clear and conspicuous opportunity to opt out of providing the information. That's one. That's section 63.31. Those are some of the exceptions. Surveillance number 2, surveillance technology does not include the following devices, software, or hardware, which are exempt from the requirements of this ordinance unless the devices, hardware, or software are modified to include additional surveillance capabilities. Routine office hardware, such as television, computer, printers that are in widespread public use and will not be used for any surveillance or surveillance-related functions. Parking ticket devices, related databases, manually operated non-wearable hand shield digital cameras, audio recorders, and video recorders that are not designated to be used surreptitiously, God help me, and whose functionality is used for manually capturing and manually downloading video and audio recordings. Cameras installed in or on a public vehicle. Cameras installed pursuant to state law authorization or in any vehicle or along a public right-of-way solely to record traffic violations patterns, provided the surveillance data gathered is used only for that purpose. Surveillance devices that cannot record or transmit audio or video to be remotely accessed, such as image stabilizing binoculars or night vision goggles. City databases that do not and will not contain surveillance data or other information collected, captured, recorded, retained, processed, intercepted, or analyzed by surveillance technology manually. I'm seeing no hands raised, but feel free to raise your hands if you want to go through this. Let me go through this list of this, and then we'll go back for any hands raised. Manually operated technological devices that are used primarily for internal city communications and are not designed to stir petitus. Who wanted that word so much? Who wanted that word so much? I'm trying to read it. Surreptitiously collect surveillance data, such as radios and email systems. Parking access and revenue control systems, including proximity card readers and transponder readers at city-owned or controlled parking garages, card readers and key fobs used by city employees and other authorized persons for access to city-owned or controlled buildings and property, cameras installed on city property solely for security purposes, including closed-circuit television cameras installed by the city to monitor entryways and outdoors areas of city-owned or controlled buildings and property for the purpose of controlling access, maintaining the safety of city employees and visitors of city buildings, and protecting city property. Security cameras, including closed-circuit television cameras installed by the city to monitor cashiers' windows and other cash handling operations and to maintain the safety of city employees and visitors to such areas. Cameras installed solely to protect the physical integrity of city infrastructure or technology that monitors only city employees in response to complaints of wrongdoing or in order to prevent waste, fraud, or abuse of city resources. So again, these are stating that these routine and operating ways are not included are not part of the surveillance and capabilities or concerns of this ordinance. And also, we just went through 63.31 and 0.2. So I have a lot of hands. That's good. Paul, did you just raise your hand again?
Yes, I did raise my hand again.
Okay, so I have Paul, Councilor Mejia, and then Chris after that.
Okay, so regarding basically K, L, M, and N, so the exemption of those, cameras and technology, when it's used to maintain the safety of city employees, protect city property, visitors, I think that's all a useful means. So I'm just curious why we're differentiating that between the other cameras that we have throughout the city that are also used to maintain the safety of the citizens who live in those neighborhoods and travel to those neighborhoods and who visit our city. Those cameras are being treated differently in this ordinance than the cameras that are in city facilities.
Sure, I can address that if you'd like.
Yep.
So yeah, thanks. I think it's an important question. So I live in Dorchester and I can see a surveillance camera from my window. There are a lot of surveillance cameras in the residential neighborhood that I live in. And I think the sensitivity of government surveillance in areas where people live, cameras that can see into the windows of people's private homes, cameras that can see into the backyards of our community members. I think that the sensitivity of those types of surveillance tools is obviously of more of a concern to residents than a camera inside the Boston Police Department that is, filming a hallway to make sure that people aren't, conducting vandalism or something like that. Or a camera that's positioned right outside the Boston Police Department to monitor, the comings and goings of people who are entering a public building. And so probably expect that they're going to be documented, their movements tracked by the Boston Police Department's surveillance. It's something really different for the city to be using surveillance cameras throughout our communities, in public parks, in our neighborhoods, again, in residential areas. The privacy issues there are significantly different. And I think people's expectation of privacy is significantly different.
Thank you. Councilor Mejia?
Yes, hi. So I only have a few questions or some concerns regarding the exceptions of information sharing component. It says that the data is voluntarily given to the city, does not have to follow the requirements of this ordinance. So I'm just curious, I think we're running into an issue where people don't always know what really means to provide information to their city government. Is there something that can be done to make people more aware of where their data goes and when they provide it, quote unquote, voluntarily?
Would you like a narrow definition of voluntarily giving it?
Yeah,
what is volunteering mean?
Yeah, I think, that it would be helpful to know.
I like that. Okay.
And I know this is crazy, but I know that they have like signs that say you're being recorded. Like, I just feel like, I don't know, there's some places that you walked into that that you're being recorded. And I think knowing that you are helps people understand what is happening. And I'm just curious if there's, not to complicate situations further, but are there ways, like, I think that we should be responsible and letting people know that they're walking into a space. Sometimes those signs are you walking into this, smile, you're on camera, but I don't think that you see all of those signs across our neighborhoods. So the fact that there are cameras, you might be even being recorded and you don't even know it. I know that sometimes I'm stopped at a red light, I'm like, oh, dag, I'm at a red light and there's a big old camera there. Like, so I'm just curious about, I don't know where this will go in terms of this conversation, but what are we doing in terms of signage to let folks know that they are being recorded?
So the two questions I have is what exactly, maybe we should define what it means to truly volunteer. And then also, how do we really advertise when people are being watched, especially in public places? So I don't know if that's making the camera hot pink or if it means whatever it means, but if the goal is to be clear that you're being watched, right? Councilor Mejia?
Yes, thank you. Exactly. I feel like it's important for us to know that, especially even if it's in a park. Like, I just think it's important for people to know that they're being recorded. It makes for good practice.
Thank you. Other hands that have gone up, or Chris, you were next, and then we'll go Emiliano, then Nayeli, then Paul.
Thanks, Madam Chair. In section 1, a question, I guess, on the intention of Part B, if that would also include SDKs that are embedded on apps that then, city, and I'm speaking specifically not about police or BPS, but thinking about other operations, mostly around transportation. Would somebody opting into an app on their phone that then provides data to a third party, which is then procured by a subcontractor of the city, be considered something that is conspicuous, that they have agreed to give up that data or not? Just question on the intent there. And then 2 other pieces in that section. Would there be possibility of adding a piece around the exclusive planning and operations of city mobility systems and utility systems, thinking about things like smart meters or blue bikes or a potential, scooter program, and wanting to be able to manage that system or those systems equitably and fairly and mitigate some of the challenges we've heard coming up. So I'll pause there. I have more in section 2, but thank you.
What was the acronym you used? SDKs?
Software development kits.
Thank you. Does anyone want to speak to those 2 questions about third parties and software development kits and apps?
Sure, Chair Edwards, I can address those questions. So first off, the intent here is to say that information that a City of Boston resident or someone else provides willingly to the city is not subject to the ordinance. I think your question is a really important one. If I provide information to the city willingly, but I don't know that the city is going to be turning around and sharing that information with Cisco or, a variety of private companies, third parties, et cetera, then I do think, yes, our intent is for the city to be transparent about how it shares sensitive personal information about residents with entities like third parties and private companies. So that's an answer to your first question. And then your second question, can you just remind me what it was?
Yeah, around sort of an exemption on using data for operations and planning of mobility systems and utilities.
Right. Yes, we absolutely want information about that as well. I mean, as you're probably aware, the state legislature is looking right now to potentially mandate that companies like Uber and Lyft share very sensitive rider data with transportation and planning organizations throughout the state. And while we don't oppose the sharing of sensitive data in all circumstances, we absolutely believe that it's necessary for the city of Boston to be transparent with the public, with the council, and to have, democratic buy-in if the city intends to collect and manipulate very sensitive information about, for example, you referenced the scooter program, where everybody's traveling all the time. I mean, location information is among the most sensitive types of information that governments and corporations are collecting. The Supreme Court has recognized this in the Carpenter case in the summer of 2018 when it held that the police have to get a warrant to access cell site location information from cell phone companies. Chief Justice Roberts, in his opinion, said, basically location information is among the most sensitive types of data. So yes, if the city of Boston is going to be collecting information from, rideshare companies, scooter companies, the city bike companies about where people are in physical space, that is certainly among the types of data that we would want the ordinance to have control over.
Okay. Going on to the other folks whose hands were raised. I think it was Emiliano, then Nayeli, then Paul, and Councilor Mejia again.
Thank you, Chairman. And yes, to answer the questions that Councilor Mejia made, I think that we could add something to 1A, something on the line of provided that they were giving notice, that they were consenting to provide this information, or some language along that line. And as to the second thing that Councilor Mejia mentioned about the notice in the parks, I think that's great. What I say that if there is a camera in the park, that will be surveillance technology, so that will not be excluded. So that will have to comply with all the other requirements of the ordinance, one of which is to have a surveillance use policy, and inside that surveillance use policy, a note, a section or a provision can be made to say that when these cameras are put in public, in parks or whatever public space, then there should be a notice that there is a camera that is filming people. So I think that the policy for those cameras are the perfect place to put those kind of issues related to how the surveillance technology is used. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nayeli?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that the point that was just mentioned about the context of usage is very important to keep in mind here. And here again, I would just underscore that one of, I think, the things that we feel really strongly about is that BPS and BPD's technology should be severed and considered separately than city departments like utilities, environment, and energy, transportation, et cetera, just because the nature of those data collection systems is very different. The example that you just mentioned about a park, for example, if it's a BPD camera in the park, the intent of that data collection is very different from when we temporarily install through a third party a park just to collect counts of pedestrians who come in and out of various exits and entrances of the park as part of a planning process. Or, for example, when we collect address, phone number, and email information for billing purposes with utilities, and then use that data to lower the cost of energy through community choice energy programs, or to identify people who might be better served by being connected with Mass Save or other energy efficiency subsidy programs because their energy use is inefficient. Those are all ways that we use data that would technically fall under the surveillance to improve the lives of residents and to deliver better services. I don't think that those systems should be exempted from any consideration or any oversight. That's certainly not the goal. But I think that we are sort of confusing context by considering everything as the same. The intent and context really matters when you're talking about data collection. And I think it's important to keep those kind of specific examples in mind.
Just a point of clarification, and this might be helpful. While you are, I completely agree, context and why people are observing things completely change depending on their goals. Does the BPD have access to that information? And can law enforcement get to those things regardless of the intent? If the access point is from parks, but it's still used to watch me, it's still government, right? And it's still maybe something worth me knowing about.
I think it's absolutely something, sorry, I went ahead and responded to you there. I think it's absolutely something worth knowing about. And that's exactly the type of like deeper policy investigation that I think we should really look into. I think that there should be a process that's very well documented if BPD wants to get access to something like a traffic camera that's been put up for a very different purpose, and that should be documented, public, approvable, et cetera. I just think that by trying to make restrictions based on the most extreme circumstance, when we have a lot of data collection that occurs very innocuously and that really helps us with planning, it's complicating a situation that I think everybody would be better served by separating.
Chair Edwards, can I jump in here quickly?
Kate, I'm really going to try and get to some folks on. Your hand is up. Do you mind if there's one person or a couple people before you?
Sure. I just wanted to respond to something that Nayeli said, but I can wait.
Thank you. Just want to make sure that Councilor Mejia. Go ahead, Councilor Mejia, and then Paul, and then Kate.
Yeah, no, I'll be quick. I just, now that we're talking about this, I'm just making me think of other places. I know entering a school building, I'm just curious, Sam, if you might be able to tell me what disclaimers or disclosures are put on entry doorways so that parents know that their children are being monitored as they walk through. Do you have that type of signage? And also, when you enroll your child in BPS, is there a waiver or some sort of I authorize or I'm entering into agreement knowing that my child is going to be under surveillance? Is there that type of level of information shared with families when they're doing their enrollment? And maybe I don't want to complicate things further, Councilor Edwards, but I'm just curious, since we're talking about information sharing, I'm just curious, it would be great for people to know. As a parent, I would like to have that understanding.
Yeah, sure. So there is some signage up in some places, and sometimes those signs get damaged and vandalized. We have to replace them. But that's our intent, is to make sure we inform families as much as possible that they're being recorded when they're on premises. But as far as informing them of that when they're being enrolled, I know we don't have that in place, but we're happy to work on that.
Yeah, I would just urge you all to do that, just because there are a lot of families who come through the welcoming center, many who are new to this country and who are not part of that norm, that there should be some sort of agreement that they, or at least it's our due diligence to inform families that they're going to be sending their children to a building that is going to be surveilled, and they should have the right to know that, and they should just, part of it should be a standard that they should sign or something. Just
does anyone have any direct? I'm sorry, I'm just going to go ahead and go in line. There's Paul, and then there was Kate, then Chris, and then Valeria, and then we're going to. Okay, it was a big section, so if people have more questions about this section, we're going to keep it to this. So, Paul.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to address the privacy issue that was raised, and the department realizes that that's a valid concern. People are concerned about their privacy. but I think we need to balance that privacy issue with, the need to protect, public safety. And how do we do that? There's different types of cameras out there. There's the fixed cameras. Most of the cameras out there, they're fixed on they're all fixed on a public location. A lot of, they're at intersections, streets. They're capturing the sidewalks, the street, the intersections. They're not, fixed on persons' backyards, in windows. Again, a lot of them are fixed. Some of them have pan to zoom capabilities that they can be, manipulated into different areas. We could certainly put things in place for accountability on that. And then as far as the other thing is, I heard the word watch mentioned a few times. With very few exceptions, are we watching real time on these cameras? The vast majority of our use of them are an incident happens. We go back and review the camera footage to see what was captured in relation to that incident. What information can we take from that camera that will further the investigation? Again, that real-time watching is kind of few and far between. It does happen, and I think we could put some things in there to, alleviate that concern about privacy. I'm not sure what it was, but I'm sure we can build something into this to, satisfy everyone's concerns.
Thank you. Cade, and Chris, and Valeria, then Councilor Flynn.
Thanks, Chair. So I have a bunch of stuff I want to respond to. One, just quickly, Superintendent Donovan, the ordinance does not take a position on the validity of any government surveillance program. It's merely about transparency and democratic oversight. So, the question of what utility the cameras provide to the city is something that we as advocates that are supportive of this ordinance are really interested in learning. We hear from public safety people, police, prosecutors, that surveillance cameras in our neighborhoods are important in terms of stopping crime and solving crime. We'd like information about that. So the ordinance is not prescriptive. It doesn't say surveillance is good or bad. It merely says, let's disclose what's going on in the city, have a conversation about it, make sure that we all agree collectively, democratically, that the technologies that are in use are things that we all support and are important. And then, as you said, Superintendent Donovan, ensure that there are the right policies and procedures and accountability mechanisms in place to make sure those systems aren't abused. So I just want to be clear about that. This ordinance does not say, all the surveillance cameras that the BPD uses in the city of Boston are going to be removed. It merely subjects to some democratic scrutiny the use of those technologies and, subjects them to democratic control. To the comments that Nayeli made, I think these are really important to address. First off, the example that you gave about the parks, that type of surveillance is not covered by the ordinance because technology that merely counts the number of people who are passing by, a given sensor does not have the capability to identify people. And so it would not be subject to the ordinance. And you can see that in the definitions section. I also just want to say that that impact and intent, somebody else raised this, that really matters here as well. I gave this example in the last working session, but some years back, the Boston Transportation Department made a really big mistake by allowing their license plate reader system that they use not for policing purposes, not for purposes that I think most people would identify as surveillance in the kind of traditional policing definition. That database was accidentally posted in its entirety online, exposing members of the public, Boston residents, to some pretty serious privacy invasion. So, the intent here is not only to say we want to have democratic control over the types of surveillance that the Boston Police Department and BPS are engaged in. It really is about subjecting all of the city's surveillance programs, any program that collects sensitive information about people, to democratic control and scrutiny, so that not only we are aligning our public our government surveillance programs with the will of the public and the goals that the public has for city administration, but so that we don't make mistakes like that, so that the administration itself is aware that there's a Boston Transportation Department program that is collecting license plate reader information, so that the BTD itself is maybe discovering problems that they didn't know existed when they're reviewing their own surveillance technologies to present information to the council about them. It's kind of a means of, having internal checks within the administration, city council checks, and then public scrutiny on those programs as well. And then the last thing I would say is that, as Chair Edwards said, a program that is developed for one purpose, data collection that is executed for one purpose can often be used for another. That's what we call mission creep, and it happens a lot. You see the development of a data system for one purpose that ends up being used by the police, and so. Another one of the purposes of this ordinance is to ensure that that type of surveillance creep does not happen without intentionality, without policy and procedure to protect the public interest and privacy and all of the other things that I think all of us care about. So, I just want to be clear on what's covered by the ordinance and what's not. And then, additionally, that I don't see necessarily a data collection program that the BTD is doing as distinct from, the interests of the Boston Police Department or even federal law enforcement agencies, because we know that if a pool of data exists, a lot of people are going to want access to it, maybe for reasons that differ from why the information was originally collected.
Thank you. Chris?
Okay, thanks for those clarifications. I think we're asking a lot of questions just to sort of understand a little bit more behind the language. So I appreciate you sort of filling in those things. Two very, specific things. In section C, the word non-wearable, in my mind, it'd be great if we remove that and only thinking about, we do a fair amount of video production for social media through the digital team and do it. They use GoPros and other devices that are essentially manual camcorders, but are worn. So curious if that's able to remove that in there, as well as later in section C, it says manually downloading. A fair amount of those systems now, even sort of the handheld cameras, will upload to a cloud service, which then you're pulling down in batch maybe. So I read that as maybe being something that falls in there or not. So again, those non-wearable and manually downloading in that section. And then in section F, and maybe this gets at something Cade was talking about in the definition of surveillance, although we sort of skipped over some of that, and it's pretty broad, and these are pretty specific. But the clause "or be remotely accessed" makes me think a little bit about some of the tube counters that transportation professionals are using to install something like a crosswalk when it's requested, or any sort of turning movements that are done. So those are usually remotely accessed, or sort of the bike counters that are out on Causeway Street. You can remotely access those. They are not collecting images or audio, but they are still sort of doing counts, right? So that's possible that falls in that surveillance ordinance or definition, but we kind of didn't go into detail there. So I would say section C and section F, those two pieces would be good to omit. Thank you.
Specifically non-wearable.
Non-wearable and the word manually downloaded.
Okay. Those are your suggestions. To the lead sponsors or advocates, any quick response to that?
Yeah, Chair, I would just say that in section C, it says that technologies that are not designed to be used surreptitiously. And so I think that accounts for the concern that you're raising, Chris. It's also illegal, frankly, for government employees to secretly audio record someone. It violates the wiretap statute. So I don't really see an issue with that.
Okay. And then, okay, so that was a response. Valeria?
Yes, I just wanted to uplift a lot of what Kate said, but I also wanted to talk about how, again, the intent of this ordinance is not to necessarily right now look at the data or go through data. But as a researcher, I have been taught that also where data comes from is important. And so if the systems that are being used are only capturing certain types of data, centralized in certain places, in certain communities, only capturing certain people, that's a problem. And I think that's something we can get to much later, which is, again, not covered by this ordinance at the moment. And I think in terms of transparency, again, the problem here is that we don't know how the city departments are collaborating with each other, if they are collaborating with each other. So that is definitely something we want to get to know according to this ordinance, which is why we do not just want information on how BPS is operating or BPD is operating. We want information on how all city departments are operating. We are not just going after BPS and BPD. That is not the point of this ordinance. And also, again, I really want to, there's like this implicit vibe right now that community is not on this. As a representative of SIM and partnering with other organizations who have worked for more than 3 years now at this point, around this ordinance, around this research to create this ordinance, we have surveyed people. And our understanding is that either the surveillance is not working, and we should look into that and why it's not working, and if there are other better ways of doing things to help the lives of people, as it's been mentioned here, right? And again, the ordinance does not cover that. We'll get that maybe later on. And so in that case, just really making sure that we're focusing on the fact that we need to know first what is here, and that we have had community voices giving an input in this ordinance and what they want to see. And the whole point is that once we do have a list of what we have at hand, the collaborations that are happening or not happening, then community can have a voice and give input on the further aspects of this later on, right? But again, this is not happening right now. That's not the intent of the ordinance. At the moment, it's to get things that we don't currently have information on, and then move into that place, right? This is not a catch-all ordinance, although I wish it would be.
Thank you. Councillor Flynn and Emiliano.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards. Councillor Edwards, I just wanted to highlight one point, if I may. Just wanted to, as we continue to discuss this, I think it might be important also to have either the mayor's team or public works, especially, to be involved. As a district councilor, we know one of our big aspects of our job is the nuts and bolts of government. But printing signs for public places is something we spend a lot of our time on, as my colleagues on the district councils would agree on. But we want to make sure also that public works has the money to do this, if it's going to be implemented in various city locations, several hundred buildings, or in several hundred in different locations too for a particular building. But we would just want to make sure, I want to make sure really, that there is money in the public works budget to address this issue if it is implemented. I think that's important. Again, the district councilors know the nuts and bolts of city government, and we spend a lot of our time on getting signs or getting crosswalks fixed or working with public works. I think their opinion also would be important in this discussion as well.
Thank you. Duly noted, and I have a feeling that this discussion will continue into another working session, so I'll be sure to invite them. Emiliano?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you for your comments. I just want to add one thing to what Kate was mentioning to Nayeli's comment. So I think it's very important to keep in mind that the definition of surveillance technologies and surveillance data are were crafted together, so that if the technology cannot possibly identify an individual, then that is not a surveillance technology, and so the data that technology creates is not surveillance data. If the surveillance technology can possibly identify an individual, then that the information created by the technology, that's surveillance data. In the case of a camera from the Parks and Recreations, just counting people, that would not be surveillance data. Or to create a heat map or something would not be surveillance data. But if there is a camera outside a train station that can catch a face of a person going out of a T station, that should be considered surveillance data, because this information coupled with other technology, for example, the Charlie Card databases can easily identify a person as doing one trip or whatever they were in the city. So that's why exactly policies are needed, so that the police department cannot access this information that is held by the transportation agency in the city. Exactly, that's why the policies should reflect this. That's why this is included in the ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually had a question about language, and then we're going to move on to section 3. Which is, again, dealing with the exceptions. So if you still have some thoughts and questions, that's fine. We're just going to add in section 3 and 4, actually. For N, being a former city employee, now city councilor, it says, an exception to this law is that technology that monitors city employees in response to complaints of wrongdoing or in order to prevent waste, fraud, or abuse of city resources. I'm just curious why the advocates wouldn't want city employees to know they're monitored as well.
That's a good question, Chair. We included that in response to some input that we received from other cities about, for example, the use of technology in internal investigations. If there was suspicion that somebody in the Boston Police Department was mishandling evidence or allowing people into the evidence room who shouldn't have been there or whatever, that, it's appropriate for the city to use technology to monitor those types of things without, providing notice to the subjects of the investigation. But, if you have concerns about that, we'd certainly be happy to discuss tinkering with that language or removing it.
Well, I think my concern is the consistency, right? If you could say we don't want people who are going to do wrong to know that they're being watched, how that very same argument might be applied then to other forms of monitoring or surveilling folks as well. That's my concern about the one. And then 2, they're city employees, but they're still obviously, people with rights and to privacy and rights to, so I personally I don't care, but if we're going to be telling everybody you're being watched, I think we should tell folks who work for the city you're being watched. That's my thoughts about that. And I'm not going to die on a hill for it, but I did want that to be known. I don't see the exception as particularly fair. Anyone had a response to that? Any other advocates before we go on to section 3? Ed Flynn, Councillor Flynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. Councillor Edwards, I would agree with you on that point. I think just in the interest of basic fairness, our city employees, in my opinion, do a tremendous job every day, especially during this pandemic. I see them in Chinatown sweeping the streets, or I see them giving out food in the Condon to families in need and immigrants, our immigrant neighbors. But just in the interest of fairness, I think we have to have a consistent policy that includes everybody. And I agree with you. I know probably people disagree with my opinion, but I think we have to also treat our city employees with respect as well.
Thank you. Paul, and then Kate.
Yes, thank you. Just one quick point on that. So cameras, surveillance. So obviously they assist us in catching, persons who commit whatever type of offense. But if they're publicized and people know about them and they know a camera's there, it's a prevention tool. It can prevent incidents from happening. It can prevent someone from being shot, robbed, assaulted, property damage. So that's a benefit of having a camera, whether it's outside of a city building, within a city building, on a city street corner, in a city park. It's that prevention aspect that is very valuable. The department believes so. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure Kate is.
Yeah, just very quickly, Chair. First to respond to Superintendent Donovan, the question of whether surveillance cameras are a deterrent is actually a very unsettled one. There have been a lot of studies on the question of whether or not surveillance cameras deter crime. The results are very mixed. So that's one example of an issue that I think is important for the public to understand. And that's why this ordinance not only requires approval of surveillance technologies and policies to govern the data and stuff, but requires city departments such as the police to report back to the council about how useful those surveillance technologies were. So, there are two separate issues with cameras. One is deterrence, which again, the studies are very inconclusive on that point. And then the other is how useful cameras are to solve crimes after the fact. And I think people assume, maybe because of shows like CSI and stuff, that cameras are extremely useful in terms of solving crimes. There have been some studies on this point, one of which was conducted in London, which is the most heavily surveilled city on earth. And it found that for every 1,000 surveillance cameras, police solved one crime per year. So, there's a real question about the utility of investing millions of dollars in surveillance if that's the kind of return on investment that the city's getting. So those specific details about how useful the cameras are, both in terms of crime prevention and in terms of solving crimes, I think are would be better addressed by data instead of, anecdotes or opinions about how useful cameras are. And that's one of the issues that the ordinance aims to get at and to help us elucidate for the public. Councilor Edwards, we would be fine with removing section H. So if you want to do that, I don't think there's any objection from the advocate side.
H or N?
Sorry, N. Sorry, N.
Oh, okay, thank you. Superintendent, are you just responding to Kate, or were we okay with going on to section 3? You're on mute, sorry.
Yeah, just quickly. So the cameras are an essential tool for the city of Boston, the police department. As far as anecdotal or what happens in the city of London, I'm not sure what goes on in the city of London, but I do know in the city of Boston that cameras are absolutely essential to our criminal investigations. And, I'm not concerned. The department isn't opposed to this ordinance. We're fine with, oversight and accountability. But we are concerned that this ordinance does give the ability to the council. It's stated later in that, the city council shall vote to approve or deny the surveillance use policy by a vote of simple majority. So as the political winds change, so can this policy. How this ordinance is used can change over time. So, it was stated earlier by, I'm not sure who, but I wrote it down that, I raised a concern and someone said, the surveillance will not stop. So, but yet it's in this ordinance that the city council can vote to approve or deny. So that's our concern, the department's concern.
Thank you. So we're going to go now to section 3 because we're really want to make sure that we at least get through hopefully this 1/3 of it today. Before I go to section 3, I keep forgetting to read this into the record. Councillor Campbell submitted a letter. Dear Chairwoman Edwards and colleagues of the Committee on Government Operations, I regretfully cannot attend today's working session on Docket 0397, Ordinance on Surveillance, Oversight, and Information Sharing. Thank you to the sponsors of this working session for continuing this critical conversation about the importance of focusing on privacy, safety, and accountability when it comes to the use of surveillance technologies and practices. I will be ably represented by a member of my staff at today's hearing and look forward to reviewing today's hearing, a recording, and committee report and working with the committee on any recommended next steps. Sincerely, Andrea J. Campbell, Boston City Council, District 4. Okay. And moving on now to section 3. And we're going to do 3 and 4. And this is again in the parts of the exceptions. Notwithstanding the provisions of this ordinance, BPD may temporarily require or temporarily use surveillance technology in exigent circumstances for a period of not to exceed 30 days without following the provisions of this chapter before that acquisition or use. However, if BPD acquires or uses surveillance technology in exigent circumstances under this section, the BPD commissioner must report that the acquisition was or use to the city council in writing within 30 days of following the end of those exigent circumstances. Submit a surveillance technology impact report, and if necessary, a technology-specific surveillance use policy to the city council regarding the surveillance technology within 30 days following the end of those exigent circumstances. Include the surveillance technology on BPD's next annual surveillance report to the city council following the end of those exigent circumstances. If the commissioner of police is unable to meet the 30-day timeline to submit a surveillance technology impact report, and if necessary, a technology specific surveillance use policy to the city council, the commissioner of police must notify the city council in writing requesting to extend this period. The city council may grant extensions beyond the original 30-day timeline to submit a surveillance technology impact report, and if necessary, a technology specific surveillance use policy. Any surveillance technology impact report, and if necessary, any technology specific surveillance use policies submitted to the city council under this subsection shall be made publicly available on the city's website upon submission to the city council. Any surveillance technology impact report, and if necessary, technology specific surveillance use policy submitted to the city council under this section may be redacted to the extent required to comply with an order by a court of competent jurisdiction, or to exclude information that, in the reasonable discretion of the commissioner of police, if disclosed, would materially jeopardize an ongoing investigation or otherwise represent a significant risk to public safety and security provided. However, that any information redacted pursuant to this paragraph will be released in the next annual surveillance report following the point at which the reason for such redaction no longer exists. Section 4. A city department head may apply a technical patch or upgrade that is necessary to mitigate threats to the city's environment. The department shall not use the new surveillance capabilities of the technology until the requirements of this ordinance are met, unless the mayor or his or her designee demonstrates that the use is unavoidable, and that in that case, the mayor shall request city council approval as soon as possible. The request shall include a report to the city council of how the altered surveillance capabilities were used since the time of the upgrade. So 3 and 4, we're dealing with the exigent circumstances provision, essentially when the police may not be able or need to use surveillance technology. They have a window of 30 days. Those 30 days can be expanded. And there still needs to be transparency after the exigent circumstances have ended. And additionally, there can be an extension by the city council. Paul.
Thank you. So again, just that exigent circumstances again. We
can go to the definition section. That's actually a good.
Yeah, what constitutes exigent circumstances?
It's defined in the definition section. Exigent circumstances means the police commissioner or the police commissioner's designee's good faith and reasonable belief that an emergency involving danger of death, physical injury, or significant property damage or loss, similar to those that would render it impractical to obtain a warrant, requires the use of the surveillance technology or the surveillance data it provides. The use of surveillance technology in exigent circumstances shall not infringe upon an individual's right to peacefully protest or exercise other lawful and protected constitutional rights. So it's at your discretion, or at the police commissioner's discretion, or good faith.
So the word similar in there bothers me. I think that probably needs to be thought about and maybe tighten up a little bit how we define exigent circumstances for the purpose of this ordinance. I don't really have an answer to that right now, but I'm comfortable with that word of similar being inserted in there. I'm not sure what's better right now, but I can talk to some people here at the department and our legal advisor and maybe come up with something.
I'm sorry, just for context, you mean this is similar to those that would render it impracticable to obtain
Yeah, just the use of the word similar versus, because we're guided by case law and we can't necessarily rely on similar. It just what constitutes similar is what I'm worried about.
If I understand this, the reason why they're bringing up the times that they're comparing it to moments where you cannot obtain a warrant, which I do believe is defined and discussed and gone throughout regulation and case law. So they're almost incorporating the same standards.
Okay, but all right. So if we say,
such as when you cannot obtain
so
a warrant?
if we eliminate the word similar and if we put in danger of death, physical injury, significant property damage, that renders it impractical. Take out similar.
You just basically you want the standard to be if you can't get a warrant and those things happen.
That's because that's our standard is it for exigent circumstances. It's impractical to get a warrant. Someone's life is going to be in danger. So we enter a premise without a warrant in order to, preserve life. So I think if you take similar out, it kind of ties, it doesn't give us, it doesn't give anyone wiggle room. That's what it is. It's similar to me. I just don't like it's too vague to me. Similar.
Okay. To Kate has raised her hand.
Thanks, Chair. So the intent here was to essentially provide flexibility on this definition pursuant to the development of case law on the question of exigency. I don't really care if the word similar is removed. It doesn't really matter to me all that much. But it is important, I think, that people understand that the exigency section, the definition and the section in Section 3 are not meant to exclude from the purview of this ordinance the police department's use of surveillance technologies in exigent circumstances. They're merely meant to provide a little bit of cushion so that if there is an emergency, and here's an example of what we were thinking of, the Boston Marathon bombing, for example. The FBI is using surveillance technology that hasn't been approved by the city council because it's the FBI and the city council doesn't have a say over what the FBI is doing. And the Boston Police Department wants to use some of that surveillance data to protect human life in that emergency. The police department can do that pursuant to this exigency exception in Section 3, but then later on, after the emergency has ended, has to go back to the council and report on the use of that technology and request approval if the department wants to use it on an ongoing basis. So I just want to be clear about the intent. It's not to create this massive carve out so that, anytime the police are conducting surveillance in exigent circumstances, that is like permanently excluded from the purview of the ordinance. It's merely to say, we get it. There are emergencies. You can't just run to the council, just like you can't run to a judge in many situations because you have to deal with the threat at hand. We get that. The word similar, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Emiliano?
Yes, thanks, Kate. I just want to add that I think that the important thing is that the situation has to be a situation where it will be practicable to obtain a warrant. And that's the impracticability is what the courts usually decide, whether in that situation it was impracticable to obtain a warrant. We just proposed these emergencies involving danger of death, physical injury, or significant property damage, because that's what usually case law finds to be impracticable to obtain a warrant. That's why the word similar is there. But if they want to take it out, that's fine. The important thing is that the situation has to be a situation where it will be practicable to obtain a warrant. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on then to, I didn't hear any comments on 4. So we're going to now discuss the surveillance use policy. That's B. I'm trying to get through all points of it. Surveillance use policy. The mayor shall submit to the city council for its review and approval a proposed surveillance use policy applicable to each city department that possesses or uses surveillance technology before the effective date of this ordinance. The surveillance use policy submitted under this section shall be made publicly available upon submission to the city council. Surveillance use policy shall, at a minimum, specify the following. A, purpose, the specific purposes for the surveillance technology. B, authorized use, the uses that are authorized, the rules and process required before that use, and the uses that are prohibited. C, data collection, the surveillance data that can be collected by the surveillance technology. D, data access, the individuals who can access or use the collected surveillance data and the rules and processes required before access or use of the information. E, data protection, the safeguards that protect information from unauthorized access, including but not limited to encryption, access control, and access oversight mechanisms. F, data retention, the time period, if any, for which information collected by the surveillance technology will be routinely retained, the reason that retention period is appropriate to further the purposes, the process by which the information is regularly deleted after that period has elapsed, and the conditions that must be met to retain information beyond that period. G, public access, if and how collected surveillance data can be accessed by members of the public, including criminal defendants. H, if information and data sharing, if and how other city or non-city entities can access or use the surveillance data, how information is shared among city agencies or between city agencies and non-city entities and organizations, including any required justification and legal standard necessary to do so, and any obligations imposed on the recipient of the surveillance data. I, training, the training, if any, required for any individual authorized to use the surveillance data or technology or to access information collected by the surveillance technology, including whether there are training materials. J, oversight, the mechanisms to ensure that surveillance use policy is followed, including but not limited to identifying personnel assigned to ensure compliance with the policy, internal record keeping of the use of the technology or access to information collected by the surveillance technology, audit requirements or procedures, technical measures to monitor or for misuse, any independent person or entity with oversight authority, and the sanctions for violations of the policy. K, legal authority, statutes, regulations, or legal precedents, if any, that control the collection, capturing, reporting, retaining, processing, interception, analysis, release, or disclosure of surveillance data and technology. And L, child rights, special considerations specific to surveillance technology and surveillance data pertaining to minor children. 4, the City Council shall vote to approve or deny the surveillance use policy by a vote of a simple majority. Okay. Paul, and then Chris.
Thank you. So just regarding section G, public access, the public, I think their access would be through freedom of information requests, or through, anyone can request a police report. But if you're getting into, other areas, I think you gotta, right now it's through a Freedom of Information Act. And if it's not accessible under that, I don't believe we provide it. As far as criminal defendants, any surveillance data for a criminal defendant, so that would be turned over through the process of discovery. So in every criminal case, Boston Police Department provides all the evidence to the district attorney's office, who then decides what is turned over to the defendant, not the police department. The police department does not decide what is turned over to the defendant and his attorney. It's the district attorney's office.
Thank you. And I think both of those could be the responses, or could be what is put into the policy. You know, if I understand this, this is requiring that each department come up with their own policy, and that those policies include the following at a minimum. So if your policy is public access is through FOIA, then I think that could just be put in there. If your policy is that access for criminal defendants will be through normal discovery procedures, I don't know that this is countering that. I think this is wide open for those definitions to be included in a future policy. This is just requiring the policy and the minimums in it.
Okay, thank you.
Am I correct, advocates? Okay. And Chris, and then Emiliano.
Thanks. This is, I guess, one of the sections where we just want to highlight the sort of lack of city staffing and capacity currently to do these surveillance use policies. Not that it's not something that should be done, but I need to make sure that, like, I think what we brought up in the sort of front end of this session and was mentioned by Councillor Flynn, making sure that we're providing the adequate budget to staff a team that's going to do this. And I realize I'm probably speaking for David because this might fall into its purview. But a lot of those mechanisms don't exist centrally now, nor do those people that can craft those policies in individual departments exist either. So there's training, there's hiring, there's a process for doing that we want to make sure that could be complied with in the 9 months from the action of the ordinance to when this needs to be completed, at least from my understanding.
Thank you. Emiliano, then Kate.
Thank you, Chair. As to what the Detective Donovan was mentioning, exactly. If that is what the police department usually do with the public access, then that should be laid out in the policy. That's totally fine. That's as was Chairman said. Chairwoman. And also as to what Chris was mentioning, I understand what you're saying. Actually, I was involved in doing this in Somerville and in Cambridge. So that's actually the biggest part of the work, as Kate was mentioning in the beginning of this working session, just like drafting the policies, but also like these policies should exist right now. I mean, these technologies are used in a way, and that should be somewhere. Or I don't think that if these technologies exist, like all the police officers can do whatever they want. I think they have some kind of guidance or whatever to use these technologies. So this is just making that public. So we think that most of the things of these policies already exist because city employees should know how to use these technologies, and they should get that knowledge somewhere if they have a doubt. Or they should consult the guidance or something. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Kate, and then David. Yeah, Kate and then David.
Thanks, Chair. As Emiliano said, I mean, if the city is spending, millions of dollars every year acquiring, maintaining, staffing the use of surveillance technologies, it strikes me as a problem that it would require so much work now in the year 2021 for the city to promulgate some standard policies to govern the use of those technologies. That suggests to me that this ordinance is urgently necessary if those policies don't already exist. And again, I'll cite the BTD license plate database, FRACUS, as an example of why I think this is not only good for the public, but it's also good for the city as a kind of means of, ensuring that the existing policies or the existing surveillance programs are only functioning in a way that advances, the city's needs while protecting the public interest. I would also say that in Somerville and Cambridge, for example, the city solicitors handled this portion of the ordinance. So they promulgated a citywide surveillance use policy that applies to all of the surveillance technologies that the city uses across departments. It may be the case that in Boston, that isn't workable or it doesn't make as much sense, and each department promulgates its own, surveillance use policy to control the use of surveillance data that is produced by those individual departments. But again, the overall surveillance use policy is really meant to provide kind of the floor level policy protections. As we'll see in the next section, there are some circumstances where the city ought to also, in addition to the general surveillance use policy, be promulgating specific use policies for specific technologies that, for whatever reason, whether it's that they collect information that's particularly sensitive or the information is used in a way that's particularly sensitive, require their own policies. So I just want to say it shouldn't be that much of a bureaucratic burden to produce the overall surveillance use policy. There are a lot of existing policies out there that the city can look at and crib from. You don't have to start from scratch. There's been a lot of work done in the information science space around fair information practices, which can be easily, adapted to a policy like this, to ensure that information collected for one purpose is not used for another, warrant requirements, things like that. So I don't think that the surveillance use policy section actually should be too much of a bureaucratic burden.
Thank you, David. And then we're going to go on to the Surveillance Technology Impact Report and Technology-Specific Surveillance Use Policy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just really want to be quick, and I wanted to touch on both what Chris said and Councillor Flynn said. I've been wanting to wait, actually, as we get to the end of this, to really get an understanding of the level of effort and what is going to be in scope, because there is a high probability that this is going to land within DO-IT. So it's
like a 99.9% probability it's going to land within DO-IT.
So, I do want to make sure that we do, it is budget season. So I do want to make sure that we clearly understand, what the level of effort is and what that's going to take in terms of man hours and what's in scope and what's not in scope. As Kate just touched on, how those policies would come out, whether it's going to be a centralized overarching policy or a decentralized policy model from department to department, whether it's schools and police, et cetera. So, I just want to make sure that we get that called out and we vet that through as the budget door starts closing to make sure that we can comply with the ordinance.
And what would, again, be helpful for those of us who are going to be in that budget room is a number. And for you to put the number in terms of hours, in terms of budget amount, it would be very helpful to see that. So that we know that. Nayeli, and then we're going on to section 3.
Thank you. I just wanted to highlight also that while the upfront cost is probably, as Cade mentioned, the highest, there is a continuing cost and resources needed to keep all of these systems up to date, particularly in terms of record keeping, compliance, and ongoing oversight after the initial audit and report has taken place. So it's not just a one-time cost, it's a higher cost up front, but there will need to be consideration for the resources that are needed both in departments and in DO-IT to maintain compliance over time.
Duly noted. So even if they got the money now, we need to make sure it's fully funded and continues. Duly noted. Section C, Surveillance Technology Impact Report and Technology-Specific Surveillance Use Policy. 1, the mayor's office must seek and obtain approval from the city council as set forth in this section prior to the city acquiring, using, or entering into an agreement to acquire, share, or otherwise use unapproved surveillance technology or surveillance data as defined in this ordinance. A, the city must seek but not accept funds for surveillance technology without approval from the city, may seek, but not accept funds for surveillance technology without approval from the city council, provided that the city shall notify the city council the funding application at the time it is submitted and include this notification, the deadline for the funding opportunity and details regarding the nature of the surveillance technology for which funding is sought. 2, acquisition of surveillance technology by city department. Unless exempted or accepted from the requirements of this ordinance, any city department intending to acquire new surveillance technology or surveillance data, including but not limited to procuring that surveillance technology without the exchange of monies or other consideration, or use surveillance technology or surveillance data for a purpose or in a manner not previously approved shall, prior to the acquisition or use, obtain council approval of the acquisition or use. The process for obtaining approval shall be as follows. A, the city department shall submit a surveillance technology impact report and, if necessary, a technology-specific surveillance use policy as described below to the mayor's office for review and approval. B, if the request is approved by the mayor's office shall submit the request, including copies of the city's department surveillance technology impact report and, if applicable, technology-specific surveillance use policy to the city council for review. C, the city council shall have 90 days from the date of submission to approve or deny request by majority vote for the acquisition or use of surveillance technology. D, contents of surveillance technology impact report. A surveillance technology impact report submitted shall include all of the following: information including describing the surveillance technology and how it works, information on the proposed purposes of the surveillance technology, information describing the kind of surveillance the surveillance technology will conduct and what surveillance data will be gathered, including a detailed accounting of which entities may have access to any surveillance data, under which circumstances, for example, ongoing automated access subject to the informal request, subject to subpoena, subject to warrant, etc. H, the locations the surveillance technology may be deployed and when. I, a description of the privacy and anonymity rights affected and a mitigation plan describing how the department's use of the equipment will be regulated to protect privacy and anonymity and to limit the risk of abuse. J, the potential impacts on privacy in the city, the potential impact on civil rights and liberties of any individuals, communities, or groups, including but not limited to communities of color or other marginalized communities in the city, and a description of a plan to address these impacts. K, and an estimate of the fiscal costs of the surveillance technology, including initial purchase, personnel, and other ongoing costs, and any current or potential sources of funding. And L, an explanation of how the surveillance use policy will apply to this surveillance technology, and if it is not sufficiently applicable, a technology-specific surveillance use policy. Number 3, a technology-specific surveillance use policy shall be required if the purpose, authorized use, data collection, data access, data protection, data retention, public access, third-party data sharing, training or oversight of the requested surveillance technology differ from the standards in the surveillance use policy submitted under section 16-63.3b and 16-63.3c. A technology-specific surveillance use policy shall not conflict with any provision of the city's surveillance use policy. To the extent a conflict arises between the provisions of the city's surveillance use policy and a technology-specific surveillance use policy, the city's surveillance use policy shall govern. A technology-specific surveillance use policy shall include all of the elements of the surveillance use policy as outlined in section 16-63.3b. Any surveillance technology impact report and, if necessary, technology-specific surveillance use policy submitted to the City Council under Section 1663.3b and 1663.3c shall be made publicly available on the city's website upon submission to the Council. What we just discussed then, and what I'd like the conversation to be, is strictly on the surveillance technology impact report. And when, as I understand this, when that is not allowed or that doesn't apply, or if there's some sort of reason why, they will go specific and ask for a specific technology-specific report. Those are the two approvals that are necessary now under the ordinance, or proposed under the proposed ordinance. So let's go through that section. And then I'm just a time check. I understand we started this late. This is now about 2 hours after my late start. Again, my apologies. I'm happy to stay on to finish the discussion on this section so that we would have gone through 1/3 of the ordinance. We will have to leave the BPS and BPD's conversation and the audit report as well as enforcement for another working session. And in between that time, the language suggestions that we just had, I'm going to try and mark it up. But I would love for the departments or advocates to come through with the markups, including deleting section N, including deleting similar, as those kinds of things, so that we're picking up and moving forward. So those are my letting you know. If you have to leave, I apologize for, again, the late start. we will continue this conversation. All right. Hands are red. Chris, and then, or is that from the last time, Chris, I think?
Nope, this is new. Yeah.
This is new. Okay. Chris,
and Madam Chair, thank you for reading through this ordinance publicly. It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, so you're doing an amazing job there. I really appreciate that. Helpful to hear it as well as look at it at the same time. And I do have to jump after this for some childcare duties during vacation week. My comment is on, I guess, section 2C, which is City Council shall have 90 days from the date of submission to approve or deny the request by majority vote. In Somerville, it's a 60-day requirement. I'm curious if it could be either 30 or 60 days here. The concern here again around procurement cycles and how that might be impacted by longer delays there. And then a question, I know in some other ordinance that exists that if there is no vote, that it is approved by default. And I'm raising that as a potential here as well. So if it does not move forward, what happens here is a little bit of a question for me. So thank you for entertaining those.
Thank you. I would like to start with the second one. I actually think that makes sense. It then forces the city council to do something, vote it up or vote it down, but can't be held in perpetuity. So just to let advocates know, that's why we might want to, I don't know, to address that concern. And then to the advocates, I guess the window is 90 days right now, and the suggestion is 30 to 60.
So Chair Edwards, I think those two questions ought to be considered together.
Okay.
If the chair is amenable to Chris's suggestion that there be some automatic approval if the council does not take a vote one way or the other, I think a longer time period is important because the council has a lot of, budget season is a good example of a time when the council has a lot of business before it and may not be able to get to something. So I think a longer time period, like 90 days, is going to be important if the council elects to, can include a provision that grants, sort of automatic approval if a vote isn't taken within that time period.
Okay. Any other, on the other part? Okay, so essentially the longer time, the more likely it is to be automatically approved or to have that as a provision.
Yeah, I'm saying if it's a short time period, there's a real danger that because the council has a lot of business before it, you just won't be able to get to something within 30 or 60 days. So if there is going to be a trigger at some point, after 90 days or something, if the council hasn't voted on it, it's automatically approved. I think that council's in favor of a longer time period during which the council can consider something.
Okay. Paul?
Yes, thank you. So just as far as the last section there that states that the impact reports and policies shall be made publicly available on the city's website upon submission to the council. So the department just has a concern regarding, say section E, information describing the surveillance technology and how it works. And then say section H, the locations the surveillance technology may be deployed and when. That could definitely have an impact on both officer safety and, the integrity of ongoing investigations, and even have an impact on, say investigations that could be down at the grand jury or awaiting trial. Those things could possibly have a negative impact on those things. Again, you could have an issue where it's something that needs to be provided through discovery potentially. I'm not sure really what information that, the detail of, how much you're looking for here, what you're exactly looking for, but it could be very problematic for the department.
Is it going back to the suggestions in section E, is it the how it works? What's the problem?
Well, information describing the surveillance technology and how it works. So if we have an undercover officer, we're inserting, I'm undercover officer into a group that's engaged in drug dealing, and we have that undercover officer wearing a piece of surveillance technology that records audio and or visual. It's a it's a pen, it's a button, it's a something on his cap, whatever it is. So are you looking for that kind of specific detail to be provided, and then that's going to be disclosed on the city's website? Or that's not going to happen?
No, that's a good question. You're asking what practically does this language mean? That's the question, correct? Okay.
Yes.
Turning it over then to Kate, and then Emiliano, you raised your hand. So Kate,
Sure.
and then
Thanks, Chair. So yeah, that's a good question. So the interpretation that the council, so basically, the city will put together its surveillance impact reports, right? So let's just take the example that you provided, Superintendent Donovan, of a covert surveillance device. Say, the BPD submits a surveillance impact report that says we have covert surveillance devices that are capable of recording audio and video. Not exactly a news flash to anybody who hasn't watched television in the past 20 years. The question of whether or not the city council is going to require more detail than that is going to be up to them, right? So they'll be able to review the surveillance impact report that the police department has provided. And if there are specific questions that counselors have about the types of covert, devices that the city is using, those are questions that can be asked. But the ordinance is not, as you can see, it doesn't get into that level of specificity, precisely because we want to provide city agencies with a little bit of flexibility on that point. I'll give you another example, though. I think a covert surveillance device is an example that I think obviously for the reasons that you raised may cause the police department some concern. The reason why E is important, though, is because there are other technologies. For example, Celebrate, right? A technology that the police department uses to download information from cell phones pursuant to criminal investigations. I think it's important that the public and the council understand what the capabilities of those technologies are, what types of data they can take from cell phones, what types of cell phones they can take data from. That information really ought not to be kept secret from the public. Another example would be like cell phone sniffing devices, right? IMSI catchers, things like that. There's been a lot of confusion in the public, for example, about whether or not city agencies in the United States are using IMSI catchers, devices that are capable of tracking cell phones that have wiretap capabilities. That's the type of information that it would be valuable for the police department to provide the city council, because an IMSI catcher that merely tracks the location of a cell phone by pinging it, right, is a very different surveillance device than one that is actually capable of intercepting text messages or email communications or phone calls. And so I think that's maybe a good example of why it's important that this be included there. Another is surveillance cameras. I mean, Superintendent Donovan, in your remarks earlier about surveillance cameras, you said that some are fixed and some have pan, tilt, zoom capabilities. Well, that's the kind of information that I think is important to present, because those are really different types of cameras, right? A camera that just films in black and white, grainy images, is a really different type of surveillance from one that has, high resolution, that can zoom in so close that you can read what someone's writing on their cell phone. You can see the passwords that someone is entering on their cell phone from, a mile away, right? That is a really different type of surveillance than a more general kind of traffic camera that's just, looking at the street and can't even really see faces.
Thank you.
I don't believe we have that capability to zoom in to read someone's cell phone from a distance, but I understand your concern, but okay. Again, it's just, we're looking at protecting, officer safety, and the integrity of investigations is our concern now.
Emiliano.
Thank you, Chair. Just adding to what Kate was saying, I just have three main observations. The first one is that this surveillance technology impact report will be basically a form that would have like all these categories, and it will be like very easy for the police department or whatever city agency is wanting to approve a technology to just fill it up. That's what we were saying. Again, the thing about the bulk of the work is in the first part, where like all these forms have to be created and people have to get used to filling these forms, which is what we saw in Somerville. The second one is that there is a formatting error I just noticed. When it talks about the surveillance technology impact report, which is EFGHIJKL, it should be tabbed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, we can do that.
Yeah.
That's not a problem.
Great. And then the issue that the detective was mentioning about, like, for example, the location of the surveillance technology and where they may be deployed and when. These impact reports should not contain any information related to an active investigation, of course, and it should not contain like the cameras will be located in such and such street. It just have to say that the cameras will be located in streets, and the decision of where to locate those cameras will be made following the following conditions or variables or whatever. We are not, these reports should not contain where the actual surveillance technology is deployed for a specific case, but how the decision on when and where to deploy it is going to be made. That's basically the policy. So that's what I want to say. Thank you, Chair.
And so just to make sure I'm clear, then this report, again, is done by the departments. It's a form that we're creating. And ultimately, how specific they're going to be is really kind of up to the department. And then if the city council decides they would like additional information, they may push back on that.
Exactly.
So in the case now, knowing I'm not a police officer, but just bringing up the case that you talked about, Paul, of the, a wire, I guess, whatever device or whatever, would, for example, and this is the advocates, look at using that as an example. If I'm Boston Police Department, I'm filling out this form, and they would ask me all the technology, and I come to this section, use of wire and covert, cameras for, undercover investigations of criminal activity, so on and so forth. Would that kind of, that's describing it as technology, what it's going to be used for. It's not saying who, when, what, where, why, or how. But that's right. And then going on to the next line, we also use a blah, blah, blah that does this generally. We also use a blah, 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 and so on and so forth. Is that what you are thinking of?
Yes. And again, I think you're right, Councilor Chair Edwards, that the degree of specificity that the council seeks is really going to be the key here, right? So if councilors have a specific question about something that is addressed in one of these surveillance impact reports, that's certainly, a question that the council has a right to ask of the city agency submitting the surveillance impact report. And there are some examples of this in Cambridge, where we've been helping the city with implementation of the ordinance, where the police department, for example, provided just very, very high level, vague and general information about some surveillance technologies. We encourage the council to ask for more information about some of those systems. So one of those, for example, was a publicly accessible database that many cities buy or rent access to, like Thomson Reuters or a Clear database. So there was just very vague description of what types of information can be obtained through that system. We encourage the council to ask for more specific information because it's our understanding from other sources, from publicly available sources, that there's a lot of very sensitive information available to the police through a system like that. So, but of course, ultimately, those questions are going to be up to the council to decide, what they want more information about and what they think is sufficient.
And of course, the Boston Police Department or any police department could respond. We're in the middle of an investigation. We can't give that information right now. They are free to also push back on saying we've given you what we can at this particular moment.
That's right, Councilor. Yeah, that's right, Chair Edwards. And I would also just say, again, to sort of zoom out for a minute and look at the scope of the ordinance and the intent that at least the advocates have here. and in fact, the language of the ordinance, this is not meant as a measure that says that the police department has to get the city council's permission every time it wants to use one of the approved surveillance technologies for a criminal investigation. This is general information about the technologies that the police department and other city agencies use in the course of their business, not any specific information about any particular investigation or specific way that the technology is implemented in, a particular criminal investigation or case or something like that. Just general rules, general capabilities, things like that.
Thank you. Nayeli and then Councilor Mejia.
Thanks. I think this is a good opportunity to, again, recognize the different context between BPD and other departments. So unintended consequences of this 90-day period could potentially be adding 3 months to procurement cycles for transportation count contracts, which are typically pretty small for specific projects, and could add delays to programs like neighborhood slow streets or even new crosswalk installations that require pedestrian counts using video analytics. Technically, the way that the ordinance is worded, anything that's using those types of video analytics would fall under, even though it's not the intent, it is the capability of the technology to be of service in those types of contracts. So I'll just stress again what Chris mentioned before, of having that be a shorter wait time to decrease the impact on procurement. Another thing that I'll mention in this section about acquisition that I think needs to be mentioned is when the city procures these types of technologies or data through third parties. So it happens not infrequently that this data collection is performed on behalf of the city by a subcontractor, and there's currently no mechanism for providing this information in those situations. So I think a clarification is needed when that is the case. Who is providing this technology impact report? Is it the city department before? But in that case, they would have to wait until after the procurement had already, or the selection had already taken place, and then do the impact report, which would add additional time? Or does it need to be submitted along with the procurement packet from the vendor, in which case you would need to provide resources to vendors to be able to answer those questions to our satisfaction ahead of time as part of their application for city contracts?
Chair Edwards, can I address some of those concerns?
Just wanted to know the administration is going to have to leave, and I just got a kind of a 10-minute thing, so you could address some of those, but Councilor Mejia is next after that, and then just trying to acknowledge the administration is going to have to leave. So
okay, so I'll just be quick. So I totally hear that, Nayeli, and again, the ordinance does not say, for example, for the use of video analytics or people counting or car counting technology, if the city knows that it uses those technologies and intends to use them in the future, you only have to get approval for them once. You don't have to get approval for that type of surveillance every time the city wants to enter into a new relationship to conduct the same type of surveillance. What this says is that if the city in the future contemplates using a new type of surveillance technology that collects new types of data that are more invasive than the types that have been approved through prior surveillance impact reports, that is the only time you would have to go back to the council to get approval. So this is not meant to say that every single time you want to enter into an agreement with a private company to collect people data from an intersection, you have to go to the council to get approval for that. It is the general concept of collecting people data using a specific type of technology that you need approval for. And then once you have that, again, unless there's a new type of surveillance data that's being collected, you do not have to go back to ask for approval every single time.
Thank you. So the concept, not the contractor. Okay, so we're approving, I don't know, roller skate cameras, the concept, not the contractor.
Exactly, and the policy that governs the use of those data, yeah.
Okay, Councilor Mejia.
Yes, it was an afterthought that I just kind of want to bring into the space, and I just want to name it and just not make any assumptions that everything that we're going to be putting out in terms of notification is done in multiple languages, right? So that I just want to make sure that I just want to be clear about that, because I didn't say that like 2 hours ago, but I just want to make sure that we do that, and that we're also really super mindful of it's not just about interpreting things. I think about information justice as so much broader than just translation and interpretation, but that we're also utilizing symbols and other ways to communicate with folks because not everybody knows how to read and write. So I just want to be really mindful of just putting that out there, that when I think about signage and I think about letting people know that they're being surveillance, that we need to be really intentional about doing it in ways that everybody understands what is happening when they enter a space. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I know the administration has to go. So I do appreciate you all for being on here, and we will pick up at BPS, the BPD, and enforcement, and as well as the annual report. I'm going to follow up with all of you to get your red lines, your suggestions for language, and just to make sure that we don't drop these points as well. I appreciate your patience, and I appreciate the work put in. We've gotten through 11 of the 20 pages. So thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thanks, Chair. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Madam Chair.